The Starside Prophecy by Tirri. Read by the author. Chapter 19. The Locksmith. When the locksmith asked my mother to marry him, she said yes, victoriously, I imagined. Her plotting had finally worked wonders. Her new acquisition had an impressive pedigree. Roy was wealthy, well-educated, witty, and had a good speaking voice. But I knew when he agreed to take care of my mum and her 2 children, it had to have been begrudgingly. She would, of course, overlook the begrudging part in the same way she always did when the facts didn't jibe with the fantasy. After Roy and my mother had been seeing each other for 3 months, they married in a civil ceremony. I couldn't understand why it had taken so long. Perhaps the annulment from the previous disaster had taken longer than expected. My brother and I were not invited to the wedding and went to stay with our grandparents in Surrey, while our mum and her new man honeymooned in Malta. Upon their return, Roy was quick to tell my mother that he no longer wanted her to work at the Monkton court. Roy had a possessive streak, and his edict was apparently a declaration that the only attention she had a right to was his. This would have been a warning sign for most women, but my mother was flattered. So my mother resigned from her job and began looking for a house for us all to live unhappily ever after in. The crass fact was that my mother was legally responsible for her 2 children, and Roy's response to this predicament was simple. I may be able to tolerate your offspring if I don't have to see them that much. Prior to us all moving in, Roy had the interior walls of the house painted mental hospital white and asked the contractor to add sand to the paint. This was to deter my brother and I from touching the walls as we passed through the rooms, especially when going up and down the staircase, which only had 1 banister. If you did absent-mindedly stroke the gritty wall, it hurt. Roy once heard me say ouch when I first grazed my fingers on the way to my bedroom, and he came out of his office and started to laugh. I hated him in that moment. The 3-storey house at 7 Monkton Road was indeed big enough that we could all live in it without having to be aware of each other's existence. It sat high up like the house in Hitchcock's movie Psycho. And just like the movie, there was a dead soul in our new house too. His name was Roy, but he was alive and well. Within the first few days of living with Roy, I realised he should have at the very least been under the care of a psychiatrist. I wondered whether my mother had arrived at the same conclusion. If she had, she hid the observation behind one of her frosty smiles and continued on as if her new husband talking to himself was the most normal thing in the world. Roy talked to himself out loud a lot. It was so embarrassing. He also liked to ridicule people and occasionally assault those who objected. He once gave his friend Paul a black eye for telling my mother that she looked pretty that evening. My mother was quick to learn that entertaining friends just wasn't worth the risk. Roy liked to live decadently, to dine out, smoke enormous cigars, shop for art and play poker. He also liked to play the piano. Roy was a gifted pianist but erratic. His mood reflected the intensity and the speed of the piece he played. We all dreaded Beethoven's Fifth, and his overexcited version of Clair de Lune would have made Debussy turn in his grave. A few months before he acquired his new family, Roy had rescued a black and white spaniel from a beach in Biarritz, France. Roy's new dog, Ritz, had to be quarantined for 6 months after being smuggled onto English soil. Roy visited his dog every day and would sit inside his 8x6 kennel with him for hours, stroking his ears and telling his dog about the long walks he planned to take him on when he was free. Sometimes Roy would visit Ritz twice a day. It was a 70-mile round trip. When Ritz eventually entered his new home, it was as if God himself had arrived. But worshipping him was not always easy for Roy, who would kick his dog, usually in the ribs, without warning. Ritz would whimper and run away, and then he would softly return. At this point, the desire to get back into his master's favour seemed to be all Ritz could think about. I saw a lot of sad things within the walls of 7 Monkton Road, but watching Ritz's reaction to being kicked and discarded was amongst the most fucked up. Ritz was a faithful and respectful dog, always waiting until his master was sitting down and relaxed before surreptitiously creeping towards his armchair. Ritz would slowly ease the upper half of his body onto his master's lap, keeping his ears flat until he was certain Roy was receptive. Roy would then shower Ritz with endless words of devotion, massaging his ears and letting the dog lick his entire face, sometimes for 10 minutes straight. Roy would then hand-feed Ritz treats to reward him for being Daddy's loyal doggy. Ritz got a lot of treats. My mother didn't get many treats, just several black eyes. As with Ritz, Roy was always so nice to her after he had hurt her. My mother either stayed with him because she was too weak to leave, or she was brilliant at deceiving herself. I wondered how many times the words, "things will get better," must have played out in her head. I was never able to exude too much compassion for my mother. I blamed her for staying more than I did for him being a nutcase. Sometimes I wondered whether something horrible had happened to him as a child. Roy enjoyed deriding my brother, referring to him as his idiot stepchild. My brother, 14 and very small for his age, would have loved to have punched Roy in the nose, but he was afraid of him. We all were. My brother's room was on the top floor of the house, and he would come and go like a mouse dodging a hungry cat. But he did occasionally come face to face with Roy. One day he stood up for my mother, who was crying after Roy had hit her. "You'd better leave my mum alone," he warned. Roy was taken aback. The little boy with the red face and clenched fist standing on the bottom stair to look taller had spoken. I think it was the only time Roy may have respected anyone. Roy was not always selfish, insensitive, cruel and aggressive, however. He was sometimes capable of being kind and compassionate and subtle, which confused us all. At first, Roy being in one of his good moods was something we were all grateful for, but after a while we became quietly resentful because there seemed to be no rhyme or reason for Roy's abrupt mood changes. Living with my stepfather was nerve-wracking, and we all had a role to play to keep things from exploding. This made us all shifty. Roy also imposed upon his tired new family many obsessive-compulsive demands, always regarding the mundane. None of us were familiar with what an obsessive-compulsive disorder was, but my brother and I soon became well versed in our response to it: tacit complicity. A standard normal family meal became an agonising eating ritual that required vigilance to get right and fortitude to endure. Roy expected us to eat with military precision, without any unscheduled variances and without complaint. Once our sighs of relief that dinner was over had been inwardly expressed, my brother and I made our way into the kitchen to help with the dishes, while Roy stood by the door to supervise. The dishes on the draining board had to drain for 3 minutes 38 seconds before drying them, plates before pans. The dish towels had to be hung up, print facing outward, drawers and cupboards closed noiselessly, no conversation allowed. It was all utter crap that no one should have given a shit about. Kids have 3 choices to make when dealing with what they are served up in life. They can tolerate their circumstances, which my brother did, rebel in futility, which I did, or run away. But a 4th option was presented to me, and the means by which I was able to escape 7 Monkton Road was totally unexpected. It was also immediate and irreversible.